Well, good morning, Blue Water. So good to see you. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you being here. Glad that you would take time to be with us. You know, I think when we tell Christmas stories in our culture, in our context, they tend to be light and fluffy and cute. I think that's how we tell our stories. They usually involve husky elderly gentlemen dressed in red, yet surprisingly can fit through very small chimneys. Sometimes we tell stories about woodland creatures who can speak. They're verbal and they have glowing appendages. Even the religious among us, when we tell our Christmas stories, often our Christmas stories are about a pudgy-cheeked baby in a surprisingly sanitary barnyard. Have you ever been in a barnyard? It's not quite like our hospital rooms. These are all pretty sterile accounts of Christmas, though, what Christmas actually is. The actual story of Christmas is actually a whole lot more gritty than that. It's actually a whole lot closer to Scorsese than it is to Dr. Seuss. So we shouldn't be coming to the Christmas table expecting to have a plate full of whipped cream. When we actually see what Christmas is about, when we actually hear the story of Christmas, we should expect the earthy notes of the finest dark chocolate and espresso. This Advent, we're picking up just a few of the threads that make up the tapestry that is woven into the story of Christmas. This tapestry begins all the way back at the very, very beginning of the Bible and culminates in the first Advent and ultimately culminates in Jesus' second Advent. I want to warn you that this week's sermon is not a typical Blue Water sermon. We're going to be, starting in a text, and then we're going to be telling the story of a whole lot more text, and we're going to do our best to make it as accessible as we possibly can. But admittedly, if you know your Old Testament, it's going to make a whole lot more sense. The thread that we're going to start by picking at this morning is a thread that starts all the way back in the book of Judges. If you have your Bible, would love for you to open it with me to Judges. Judges 19 is where we're going to start. If you hear about Judges, you should think about the structure of Judges. I'm going to take a minute and tell you a little bit about the structure of Judges. You see, Judges has this cycle that's in it. It starts, this cycle, it happens again and again and again. It starts with the people of God turning away from God and worshiping other gods. They worship false gods. They worship idols. And so they turn away from God. And after a little while of God trying to get their attention and trying to get them to turn back to Him, in order to actually get their attention, He would bring in oppressors to do what oppressors do. And after the people of God were oppressed for a little while, they would get to the point where they're like, hey, okay, we can't handle this anymore. So they would cry out to God for a deliverer, and God would send a deliverer. And in the book of Judges, the deliverers that He would send were called judges. And the judge would deliver them from their oppressors, and that generation would follow the Lord. They would worship the Lord, but guess what would happen with the next generation? What do you think would happen? They would start the cycle again. They would turn away from the Lord and worship other gods, and this cycle happens again and again and again through the book of Judges. As a matter of fact, you know how many times it happens in the book of Judges? Everybody hold up 7 fingers. 7 times. This is the structure of the book of Judges. And you're reading through this book and you're like, what is going on? Can't you guys just get this? And then we think about our own lives. Then you get to Judges chapter 19. You come out after the last judge. The last judge that's recorded for us is Samuel, but the last judge in the book of Judges is Samson. And there are 3 chapters, chapters 19, 20, and 21 at the end of Judges that are just so weird. I'm gonna tell you right now, they are just so weird. And Judges ends on a very strange note. I have to tell you, these chapters are gritty enough to make even Zack Snyder blush. Merry Christmas. Judges chapter 19 is where we are starting this morning. And let's look at this story, Judges chapter 19, verse 1. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Now, a certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And his concubine was unfaithful to him. And she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there some 4 months. When her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and to bring her back, he had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys. And she brought him into her father's house, and the girl's father saw him, and he came with joy to meet him. And his father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with him for 3 days. Let's talk about this. Because there are some questions that are before us in the text. And the first question is, why would someone who was unfaithful, and the ESV says unfaithful, the King James Version says it much more forcefully. It says that she played the whore. And why would someone who would be unfaithful travel away from her husband to her father's house for 4 months? Why would she do that? Well, the text doesn't actually come out and say it, but I think we all know what the text is saying, don't we? She got pregnant. And she hid it as long as she could hide it. And after she couldn't hide it anymore, she went and traveled to her father's house so that she could have the baby. Now, the text isn't saying that, but the text is kind of saying that. And we won't take the time to actually read the story. I'm going to summarize the rest of it for what happened for a little bit here. I think that what happened when that Levite tried to woo her and win her back, I think he got to her father's house and realized for the first time, there's a baby. It's not mine. There's this kind of weirdness that's a back and forth thing where he stays with the father for 3 days, stays at their house for 3 days, and then it's weird even for the hospitality codes of that culture where the father's trying to get him to stay longer, and he doesn't want to stay longer, but he ends up staying longer, so he stays for 5 days. And I think what was going on there was they were trying to convince him to take this baby home with them. But after 5 days, it becomes clear that he doesn't. He finally leaves, and so he saddles up his donkey, he takes his servant, and he takes his concubine, and they start heading off back home. However, they didn't get a very early start in the day, and so as it starts getting dark, and they didn't have police or anything like that, so as it starts getting dark, your life starts becoming more and more in danger. They decide the only place we can stay is in the city of Gibeah. Now, Gibeah was the capital city of the tribe of Benjamin, okay? And when you hear about Gibeah, you're supposed to hear, those guys are the worst. Okay, so when you hear about Gibeah, what are you supposed to hear in your mind? Those guys are the worst. Why do I say that? Well, because they get to Gibeah and they have to spend the night, or they're looking to spend the night in the town square. That is completely against the hospitality codes in the ancient Middle East. It is so weird. And the original audience who read that, every single one of them would be saying, those guys, Gibeah is just the worst. The people in Gibeah are the worst. What happens is that there's, before it gets to be night, there's a guy who's not even from Gibeah. He's from Ephraim, and he's just living and working in Gibeah for a time, and he comes home after a long day of work, and he sees them setting up camp in the town square, and he's like, what are you doing? Come to my house. So they end up going to his house. The only person in the whole town who actually lived out the expected hospitality codes wasn't even from Gibeah. So you're supposed to hear that Gibeah is the worst. And we pick up the story again if you skip down to verse 22. As they were making their hearts merry, so they're getting settled in this guy's house. As they're making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house that we may know him. And the man who was the master of the house went out to them and said to them, no, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man has come into my house, do not do this vile thing. What's going on here? Well, what's going on here is that the dudes of Gibeah, they got together and they said, well, we haven't raped a priest for a while, because the Levites were the priestly class, the priestly tribe in Israel. We haven't raped a priest for a while, and so they were literally trying to pound down the door of this guy so that they could get to him. And again, because of the hospitality codes, this guy is like, whoa, no, don't do this wicked thing. And there's all this strangeness that we won't take time to read, but weirdly, this Levite, who up until now has been a bit of an empathetic kind of person, loses all the empathy that we could have for him in an instant because he grabs his concubine and shoves her out the door like a lamb to the wolves. And this is so strange. Why would he do this? What would cause someone to do this in this change of heart? Because not that many verses before, he had actually gone on this great long journey to try and speak tenderly to her and woo her and win her back. What would change in him to the point where he's just like, out the door you go? Seems like if he found out there was a baby that wasn't his, that might explain for that data point. And this is the part of the story that gets really not easy to talk about. Because the evil men of the city abused her, and by morning, she was able to, when they finally let her go, she was able to make her way back to the house where they were staying, and the text says that she got to the door of where they were staying, and that's where she died. And this is horrible. But you also kind of have to wonder to yourself, like, okay, if you're not going to be the hero and go and save her, if you're not going to do that, wouldn't you at least be listening for if she could get away to bring her back in? Wouldn't you be at least listening? What could cause such hard-heartedness? What could cause that? The next morning, very strangely, the morning comes, and it's just like this Levite is like, well, that was a weird night last night. It's time to go. So he opens the door, and the text, it sort of indicates that he almost has to step over her at the door. He's like, get up, it's time to go home. He doesn't even realize that she's died. And when he finally realizes it, he takes her body and puts her body on his donkey. And you're thinking like, man, this is as bad, it could not possibly get worse than this. But it gets worse. Look at verse 29. So he takes her home and takes her body home, and when he entered his house, he took a knife, and taking hold of his concubine, he divided her limb by limb into 12 pieces, and sent her throughout the territory of Israel. And all who saw it said, such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak. This is horrible. It's all kinds of horrible. It's horrible in every direction. It's horrible to us, and guess what? The people in that day, it was horrible to them too. It was so horrible that the whole nation, all of the tribes got together and said, Gibeah's got to go down. We've got to take that place out. It is so wicked. And so they gather together, the 12 tribes, and it's like, okay, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to wipe them out. Gibeah was the capital of the tribe of Benjamin, and so the rest of the tribe of Benjamin says, well, we're going to actually side with these guys. So they actually side with the Gibeonites. Very strange decision. The other 11 tribes are like, all right. So there's a civil war in Israel. And they asked the Lord, okay, which of the tribes should go up and attack Gibeah and the Benjamites? And God says the tribe of Judah should go. And that's a great call because Judah was the largest, strongest, most powerful, most successful tribe by far out of all of them. So the tribe of Judah is like, we got this. So they muster their forces and their armies, and they go marching out to attack Gibeah and the Benjamites. The first day, something very strange happens. The fighters come out of Gibeah, and they just it's a walkover. They just totally give it to the army of Judah. And Judah has to flee, and there's a bunch of their soldiers are killed in this. And they're like, God, what's going on? The next day, they come out to fight again. This time, they have a plan. They draw the fighters away from the city of Gibeah, and then there's another army, another force that sneaks in and burns the place down and kills almost everyone in the entire city. And then they turn, and the fighters from the tribe of Benjamin are caught in a kind of hammer and anvil attack here, and they are almost wiped out. As a matter of fact, it gets to the point where the tribe of Judah has to stop because they're worried that they're going to kill every single Benjamite. It's such a slaughter that the whole tribe is almost wiped out. You might be thinking, well, who cares? Well, God has 11 tribes of Israel for a purpose. And if you follow the story, 1,000 years later, there's a guy who was born. His name was Saul. And then he ends up getting his name changed to Paul. Oh, yeah, the Apostle Paul, who was actually from the tribe of Benjamin. So God had a purpose in that. And everything is bad at the end of the book of Judges. There is no bright light at the end of the book of Judges. You read the end of the book and you're like, what did I just read? This is crazy. As a matter of fact, the last verse, we'll throw it up on the screen for you. This is the last verse in the entire book. Here's what it says. It says, in those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And even though the end of the book of Judges is so weird, and that cycle of sin, repent, it stops at the end of chapter 18, and there's this chapter 19, 20, and 21 that is just so strange, and there's this concubine, and what is going on here? What is the purpose of this? Well, there is a purpose to those chapters. You know what the purpose is? The purpose is it's actually setting up the blood feud between Benjamin, particularly Gibeah, and Judah, particularly Bethlehem. There's a blood feud between Benjamin and Judah that goes back to these events and ultimately goes back to that poor concubine. If you're like me and you went to Sunday school, you probably know what book comes after the book of Judges. Go ahead, sing the little song in your mind. Did you guys have to sing the little song to know your books of the Bible? No, you just know them? Well, I have to sing the little song. So after the book of Judges comes the book of Ruth. Very good. Except not in the Hebrew Bible. In our Bibles, Ruth is put right after the book of Judges because the events of Ruth take place during the time period of the Judges. But in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Ruth actually comes after the book of Proverbs because there's some linguistic connections between the Proverbs 31 woman and Ruth. So Ruth is the Proverbs 31 woman, okay? So in the Hebrew Bible, after the stories in Judges comes Samuel. And at the end of Judges, in those last 3 chapters, there's also no names. The concubine doesn't have a name. The Levite his name's not given. The father, his name's not given. The only names that we have Bethlehem that's mentioned, and then we have the city of Gibeah. Gibeah is mentioned over and over and over again. And Gibeah is the through line that comes through those last chapters into Samuel. You don't get very far into Samuel before you find that the people of Israel want a king. They demand a king, and so God gives them a king. He gives them a king by the name of, who remembers? Starts with an S and ends with Saul. King Saul. And there's this weird moment in, where is it? In 1 Samuel chapter 10, where Samuel is trying to anoint Saul king, and Saul says, why do you want me to be king? I come from the smallest clan or the smallest family in the smallest tribe. Why did he say he came from the smallest clan in the smallest tribe? Because Saul was from the city of Gibeah in Benjamin. The reason why his city was the smallest city is because that city got almost entirely wiped out. The reason why that tribe was the smallest tribe is because that tribe got wiped out. Well, then the story goes on, and God rejects Saul as king because of his unfaithfulness, and then he anoints another king. And that other king is David from the town of Bethlehem in the tribe of Judah. So what's happening at the end of the book of Judges is it's setting up the blood feud between Benjamin and Judah, between particularly Gibeah and Bethlehem. And that blood feud flows all the way into 1 Samuel, where it is continued in the lives of Saul from Gibeah and David from Bethlehem. That blood feud continues on. Last summer, during the summer, the last part of the summer at least, we taught through the story of the life of King David. You remember those sermons, right? No, you don't. Be honest. That's okay. I don't either. But there was one that we covered in 1 Samuel chapter 16. There's this odd moment where the Samuel is told by the Lord to go to Bethlehem and go to find this guy named Jesse, and he says, you're going to anoint one of Jesse's sons to be king. And so Samuel goes and he says to Jesse, like, hey, I'm going to anoint one of your sons king. Bring all your sons out. And Jesse's like, I've got 7 sons. Well, we find out that actually, like, when you read the text, you sort of feel like it's going to, like, this happened the next day. Well, we find out that at least 1 and maybe as many as 3 of Jesse's sons were in military service to King Saul. So almost certainly they would have had to send to the army to where those guys were serving. So probably a couple of days, probably out to Gibeah where Saul's capital was, and get Eliab and maybe the other brothers too and bring them back. So this is days and days and days later. Finally, they assemble Jesse's sons in front of Samuel, and Samuel's like, I'm going to anoint one of you king. And so the oldest, Eliab, walks past, and Samuel looks at him and goes, that dude, that's king material right there. What a great king the Lord has chosen for us to be king over the nation. And Eliab walks past, and God's like, not him. Man looks on the outside, but God looks on the heart. Samuel's like, all right, next one. And so one by one, these 7 brothers pass in front of him, and God says no to every single one. And you can probably picture Samuel being so confused, maybe this quizzical look on his face. And the last one walks past, and God says no. And Samuel's like, Jesse, do you have any more sons? Like, what is going on here? And Jesse goes, oh yeah, there's the small one. He's out with the sheep. And I was always told that the reason that happened was because, well, it was the job of the smallest son, the youngest son, to, he wasn't really part of the family the same way that the other ones were, and he would have to do the menial jobs and all that. The problem is, once you start looking at the Bible, that idea doesn't actually appear in the Bible anywhere. It'd be very strange. And I've heard some people say, well, clearly Jesse wasn't that wealthy, and so he would have, somebody needed to stay with the sheep. Well, read a couple verses farther on, and we find out that Jesse had other workers that David could have left with the sheep. So that we're left with this strange question: why wasn't David invited with these other brothers? Very, very strange. Now, I know this is a lot of data points, and I know we covered a lot of text. I know we told a lot of story. But the reason that I'm telling all this is because I have a theory that I think explains all this, even though it makes me look kind of like this guy or feel kind of like this guy. Here's what I think. There's no names in the book of Judges, in chapter 19 and following, rather. And so we don't know for sure. But I think that concubine went to her father's house, and I think her father's name was Jesse from Bethlehem. Bethlehem is a small town, small community. It still is today. There might have been 10 families in that community. And if she was Jesse's daughter, and if she was actually pregnant, then it stands to reason that it's possible that that child that she was pregnant with was actually David, which would technically make David Jesse's grandson, not his son. You might think, well, hold on, that doesn't make sense in the text. Well, listen, they didn't really care about the technicalities of grandson versus son like we do. So, for example, they would be quite happy to say Barrett is Tim's son, even though we would say, well, Barrett is the son of Tim's son. Follow what I'm saying? They would be actually quite happy with that. And if this were true, it would explain so many things. First of all, it would explain why Jesse brought only his 7 actual sons when Samuel said, hey, bring your sons. And Jesse's like, all right, I brought them all. And like, well, don't you have any other sons? Oh, well, there's the smallest one. That would explain that. It would explain why when the Bible talks about David's appearance, the way that it explains him, the way that it describes his physical appearance, he did not look like normal Jewish guys in that day, in that time. He didn't look like normal Jewish guys at all. That would explain that. It would explain the wrinkle and the weirdness between Jesse and David and between David and the other brothers. David was not the kind of guy that a father would be ashamed of. Well, why do I say that? David, it would be like if David was the captain of the football team who was also the MVP, who led his team to a state championship and saved a cat out of a burning building and also had a #1 record on the charts. Everyone knew about David's musicianship. He wasn't just playing for his sheep. All the way out in Gibeah, they had heard about what a great musician was. He was like Andy back hanging out with his sheep, and everybody knew it. In addition to that, he also killed a lion and a bear with his bare hands. Andy, have you ever killed a lion and a bear with your bare hands? Andy says yes. So he was not only a startling musician, he was an athlete, he was a warrior. The text says that he was startlingly handsome. He was the guy who all the other guys in the room are like, that guy's got too much going for him. There's something going on there. And all the girls were like, that's the kind of guy David was. He's not the kind of guy that a father would be embarrassed of. He's the kind of guy that a father would puff his chest out with pride every time his name was mentioned. And yet, there's this weird embarrassment that's clear in the text between Jesse and David and between David and the other brothers. What would explain that? You know what would explain it? What would explain it would be if his mother was the one that everyone knew was unfaithful, who was then abused, and really the cause of this civil war that almost wiped out the tribe of Benjamin, King Saul's tribe. If King Saul's tribe almost got completely annihilated because of your mom, you could see that would maybe explain that there was a little bit of weirdness in that situation. And you might be thinking, Tim, that is a total stretch. You might be right. However, it would explain what David said in Psalm chapter 51, verse 5. We'll throw it on the screen. In the New International Version, this is what it says. It says, "Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me." In other words, the way that the New International Version renders it, it's like original sin. We all have original sin. But that's not what's going on in that text. The ESV that we read from says it far better in Psalm 51, verse 5, ESV. It says, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." That's a strange thing to say, because not every child is conceived in sin. Not every child is brought forth in iniquity. But if that concubine was his mom, then all of a sudden this makes a whole lot more sense. So this is a theory. I believe it, probably 95%. There are some difficulties that come with it for sure. Pastor Scott, I figured that he believed it probably about 60%. And when I told him that, he said, "I believe it's 60%, so maybe it's lower than 60% for Pastor Scott. I don't know." But I think the big thing that it does have going for it is that it's consistent with the way that God tells story in this world. Here's what I mean. Judges 19 starts with this unfaithful concubine who is traveling back to Jerusalem to her father's house. And 1,000 years later, there is another lady named Mary who was also traveling to Bethlehem. Both of them were traveling pregnant, out of wedlock. One of them in shame and unrighteousness, the other one in righteousness. If this theory holds, if it's true, then they were both traveling carrying kings. One of them was the most important king of Israel, King David. The other one was the king of the universe who we talked about during catechism. The king who would live the perfect life of sin, or without sin, make sure I get that right. Start throwing rocks. He would live the perfect life without sin, the perfect sinless life. But even though he lived without sin, he died the death that sin deserves. But he didn't stay dead. He rose again from the dead, conquering Satan, sin, and death, so that you and I could be forgiven for our sins. What am I saying? What I'm saying is that Die Hard is a Christmas movie, and Judges 19 is a Christmas story. The family of our Savior was not a neat and tidy family. They wouldn't have worked well on a Hallmark card. They wouldn't have worked well in a Hallmark movie. Last I heard, Scorsese doesn't do Hallmark movies. The other day, I was at our Divine Street campus. You may know that our offices are over there. And I was waiting for something by the front door. I don't remember what I was waiting for, but it must have been in the morning. And I was sitting there waiting, and the sun was at just the right angle so that it was shining through the door. And you might, if you've been there, you probably know that above the door, there's a beautiful stained glass window. And the sun was shining right through there. And I was thinking like, man, that is a startlingly beautiful stained glass window. Do you know the story behind that stained glass window? That building was built in the 1960s. And the reason why it was built in the 60s is because there was another church that was there, and a young guy broke in one afternoon and lit 6 fires throughout the building. And by the time they figured it out, they were able to get control of 5 of the fires, but the 6th one took hold. And they couldn't get a hold of it, and it burned the building down. And the fire department was there all night trying to make sure that it didn't catch surrounding buildings on fire. If you've been down there, you know the buildings are super close. And one firefighter all night kept his hose on that window. He kept water on that window all night. There was a bunch of other stained glass windows in that building. And what you probably know what happens with stained glass when things get hot. It all the lead or whatever it is melts, and they all were destroyed. But that one window was saved by that one firefighter keeping his hose on it all night. And as I was thinking to myself about how beautiful that window was, it occurred to me, what is stained glass? Like the stained glass windows, what are they? They're just shards of glass. And what are shards of glass? They're just kind of a mess. What do you do with glass when you break it on your kitchen floor? You don't save it. You sweep it up carefully and throw it out. I suppose you could throw it in Lake Huron and come back in a decade to get that cool sea glass. You know what I'm talking about? But other than that, it's just a mess. But when you put these shards of glass in the hands of a master, the master can make beauty out of all that mess. As a matter of fact, when you have a master that can put these shards of glass together, and when the sun shines through it at just the right angle, I'm not sure if there's anything more beautiful that humans can make. Striking. And friends, you might be here this morning and you might be thinking, there is nothing and no one that can fix the mess of my life right now. Nothing can fix the mess of my life. What I would say to you is turn to Jesus. He is the master. He is the one that can take the mess of your life and put it together so that it makes sense, and put it together so that it can be startlingly beautiful too. Turn to Jesus. Turn away from your sin, repent. Turn to him in faith, believing that he can do all that. He's been doing it for a long time now. He can make beauty out of your life too. So this Christmas, let's not be looking for a plate of whipped cream. Let's have our palate enriched and grown and deepened with the richest dark chocolate and the best espresso. Let's believe in Jesus. Merry Christmas. Let's stand and sing.